Nature versus nurture. It's one of the most important questions we think about in terms of leadership development. I'm Alan Nelson, and in this session of KidLead, we're going to give you, as educators and parents, some insight into why this is important and what science tells us about the nature versus nurture of young leaders. Welcome to KidLead. Now, if you haven't seen the other video on this topic, you might want to look up leaders. Are they made or are they born? In this session, we're going to go a little bit deeper, though. We're going to talk about nature versus nurture. You see, this is a very important question because if we have the idea that anyone can become a leader and it's all about nurture, it's about development, then, well, we don't need to worry about natural talent. And we can focus solely on training, techniques, methodologies, and ultimately we can raise expectations on students because we're going to assume that any student can become a leader. But if we believe that nature is a part of it, then we need to consider some other things. For example, we need to identify talent really early so that if we find talented students, we can start them on an accelerated training program. And it also helps us align expectations based on wiring so that we can have higher expectations of others, but also lower expectations so that we don't create undue stress and unnecessary damaged self-esteem. That's why we want to understand the balance between nature and nurture, what's important for us to understand as educators and parents. Let's go a little bit deeper. Now, over the last couple centuries, we've seen the rise of democracy across the world, and we have this idea that anyone can become a leader. So we read books, we go to seminars, and we have this sort of concept. The problem is that what we've learned in the last 20 years, 10 to 20 years on genetic research, we discover that actually there is a predisposition to lead among certain people. And it's very important for us to keep up with science as well as understand and develop expectations for our kids and for our young people. Let me give you some of the background just of some of the things we've discovered in genetic research regarding leadership. For example, there is no one gene, but we did discover a gene called RS4950. And it tends to be an inherited DNA sequence that's often associated with taking charge. 24% of this is based on heredity. This is why sometimes it was referred to as the leadership gene, even though we know there is no one gene. But what we know from studying twins, identical twins versus fraternal twins, over the course of their lives is that about a third of the variance in leadership role occupancy can be explained by genes, meaning we inherited a certain disposition. And depending on what trait you look at, we can determine that about 10 to 60% of leadership traits are inheritable, meaning that we were born with them and we basically developed them as we grew, meaning we had them naturally, but then we developed them through growth and maturity. We know that genes affect the development of individual attributes, affecting the predisposition to occupy a leadership position. So that heritable personality like extraversion incorporates several different attributes, including sociability, gregariousness, exhibitionism. And these are qualities we know that leaders tend to have versus those who are not leaders. We also know that when young people, children and preteens and even youth begin to show these inclinations, these predispositions, that we also begin to see that they get reinforced by society. So early dominance behaviors tend to segregate children into supervisory roles, and thus these children get more practice, which tends to increase their skills and their confidence and gets reinforced further. So all this to say is that it's important for us to recognize the role that genes have to play, not to determine or guarantee, but rather to establish a predisposition that often gets rewarded throughout years of life and development. So we talked about how these nature predispositions can lend themselves to reinforcement. So that has to do with nurture. So let's talk about some of the other nurturing elements, the environmental elements that can help shape or even deter leadership development at a very young age. Naturally, parents are very influential. A child who has parents who are themselves leaders in leadership roles will often find that when they come home, they allow their child to practice leadership, or maybe they intend to be or make them into leaders, make them like themselves. This can be positive. It can also be detrimental if the child's not wired that way. Conversely, sometimes we've seen that in homes with strong leaders, they actually take over leadership in the home and they never allow the child to develop their own leadership ability. They thwart their young leaders' development. We also know that cultural norms influence. Certain cultures tend to expect children to remain silent, especially among adults, and more passive, whereas other cultures allow children to be themselves and to exude their personalities and their unique qualities. So cultural norms can affect it. And in siblings, we also know that birth order can influence it. People who study birth order realize that there tends to be a skewing toward firstborn and only children in terms of leadership. So certainly leaders can be secondborn, middle children, or lastborn, but there tends to be a skewing toward birth order, toward first or only children. And early opportunities. Naturally, some children have more opportunities than others to develop and experience training. That's one of the reasons why we developed our KidLead and Lead Young training systems curricula that allows children at all stages to have curriculum that's really designed for their development based on their age and stage. We also know that modeling is important. So if they've seen a significant other, it could be a sibling, it could be a parent, it could be a teacher, but having a mentor that sort of spoke into them and said, I see leadership in you, is a way to develop that at a very young age. Naturally, and we've talked about it before, but school conditioning can be a very negative or very positive experience in the life of a child. By nature, schools tend to be more compliance-oriented, and so they tend to thwart leadership development or only allow leadership development for a very few. Conversely, some schools sort of are under the impression that anyone can be a leader, and so they define leadership differently than we do. We define, again, leadership as the process of helping people accomplish together what they would not or could not as individuals. And that stake in the ground allows us to see leadership more for organizational development, not just for being a good person or a self-actualized person. And then, of course, beyond that, we see the significant role of other influencers in the life of a young child, a young leader, who, again, it could be a coach, it could be a grandparent, it could be just even a stranger who says, I see leadership in you, and all of a sudden that seems to just light this spark of this ready-to-lead young person. One way to think about young leaders is kind of like this foam ball. You can press it, you can make an indent, you can squeeze it, but it still has its own shape that wants to restore to that. And it's kind of like the nature-nurture component in young leaders. I hope this has been helpful for you to think in terms of how you can develop or establish proper expectations for those 3 to 18-year-olds in your influence in your midst. My name is Alan Nelson, and until we meet again, remember, if you want to change the world, focus on leaders. But if you want to change leaders, focus on them when they're young.